So we're here for our October webinar on photograph preservation. This webinar is meant for family heirlooms, but it can also be applicable to small museums and archives with small budgets. We're not going to discuss cold storage or anything too fancy, but things you can do at home that are fairly cost effective. There we go. Okay, so I'm Emma. Backlog is my little company. I am a certified archivist and I'm currently an archival consultant. I'm working with St. Louis University High School and some other historical societies in town. Just giving a little bit of advice. We're working in policies and procedures. We're setting up some databases. I was previously Maryville University's archivist, and before that I worked in genealogy reference. So I've been working professionally for almost 10 years. And I have my MLIS and I'm a certified archivist. So some of the things that we do here at Backlog, we do a lot of genealogy research. We'll do anybody's family history, but we're very good at finding things in St. Louis. We also work on family digital archives, so scanning your family collections and putting them into a website that's accessible to all of your family. And we also work with institutional archives, so schools, historical societies, anything that isn't a private collection in your attic. These are a few of our past projects. So at the top right, that's me with the archives team over at St. Louis University High School. They've been a client now for a little bit over a year. On the left-hand side, that's an example of a family digital archive where we've scanned all the photographs. And we also record the metadata while we do that. And so anything that's written on the back, the time, the place, any of those little details that are sometimes lost when you just scan and get rid of the original, we make sure that we capture all the data around it. And then we've been putting it in this platform, permanent.org. It's run by an endowment. So then hopefully that website will be around when we're gone. And then in the bottom right is a baptism certificate, and it's in Old German. And I've got team members who can translate German, Latin, and French. So if you come across any old documents. So if you are interested in any of our services, we always do an archival needs assessment. If you're an organization, we can come on site. If it's just some family heirlooms, I'm happy to visit them or do a phone call just to kind of talk about how you'd like to make them accessible or how you'd like to preserve them. Okay, so this is an overview of what we're going to talk about today. What I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to do a very brief history of photography and then go over the environment in which you should store your items, how to handle the items, and then what kind of storage is best for each kind of photograph. So we really will go over prints, and prints are just, like all types of family prints, from Walgreens things to Brownie cameras, just all the basics. Metal plates, we'll go over how to store those, and then specifically glass plates. Now you might not have glass plates in your family collection, but if you work at a historical society, I bet you've seen a couple of them. They're fragile, but you can still make modern photographs from them. They're kind of cool. And then we'll also go over scrapbooks. That's kind of our wild card. And then right here, that's a photograph of Philippine Rose Duchenne, and she's a saint, and that's a glass photograph. It was a lantern slide. And so very, very brief history of photography. Joseph Niepce in France started it in the late 1830s. He was working from a camera obscura and then was able to transfer it onto a light sensitive. It was actually on a pewter plate. That was the first photograph. And the first one took 8 hours to develop. And then later on, he worked with his associate, Louis Daguerre, and they helped, and then together they developed the daguerreotype process, which was the first commercial process that can be duplicated. Okay, so this is going on in France, right? At the same time, Henry Fox Talbot is also kind of coming up with photography in the 1840s. I took a history of photography class in undergrad, and it was taught that it was almost invented at the same time. He invented a salted paper process, and then after that he invented the calotype process, which was the first negative positive process. And it's kind of like how we think of physical photographs today, where you can make multiple copies from your negative, your original. And that's one of his first photographs with the negative and the positive. And that's a very, very brief overview of history of photography, but that's kind of its origins. And so here's more of a timeline about how we get to where we are today. We had the collodion process in 1851, which reduced exposure time just down to a couple of seconds. And then you have George Eastman with the Kodak roll film camera. And then, you start having mass-produced cameras with the Brownie camera around 1900. And then in 1927, we have the modern flashlight bulb, 48, the Polaroid, instant color film in 63, and then autofocus in 78. And then one thing that's not on here is in 2000 was the first camera phone. And I remember my first camera phone, it was a Razor. We've come a long way. All right, so the environment of where you want to keep these. So we want to stay around for VOCs. And that's basically anything that's an off gas that's really bad for not only materials, but for humans. So for example, if you just painted a room, you don't want to store your very old photographs in it. That can actually ruin some of them. And that's really going to become a problem when you're turning over gallery spaces, and they say to wait a month before you hang photographs in a recently painted area. If you're going between gallery shows, a month is a long time, but that's the suggested amount of time. Again, it needs ventilation to allow for the air to be clean. They say that paper is really good at that. You want to control the humidity, like what we talked about in the paper preservation webinar last month. And then also we want to control any environmental fluctuations. So even if you're a little bit high in the humidity side, you want to make sure that it's not on a roller coaster. The more secure you can make it or stable, the better. Okay, so this photograph is an envelope in which I found slides, and they had been in the archives for about 20 years. They dated back to the late 50s, and in the envelope were a bunch of Kodachrome slides that we were able to take to a local, not Walgreens, photography studio, and they were able to develop them. So they were just in this, not archival grade envelope, but they were in an archive and also indoors in a stable environment for like 40, 50 years, and they were fine. So it's really about the environment. Like, you don't want to put these materials in like an attic where, like it's really humid and it's really cold. Okay, so this is handling of the materials. This is a class that I taught. I had students come in to see different types of photographs. And so you really want to avoid contact of your skin with the image layer. So like kind of that top emulsion. Your body oil can leave marks that may not appear until later. And then you want to handle the photographs with clean cotton or nitrile gloves. So just certain things that won't deposit anything on that top layer. And then we've got a student here who's looking at some lantern slides with the gloves on. And then for storage, how we want to store these, you want to store them in envelopes and then in boxes. So an envelope or a folder. And so do you see how these photographs are in plastic sleeves and then they're in the box? And then putting them not only in a box, but in the sleeves protects them from abrasion, dust, and pollutants. And then for this, you really want to use paper or polyester. And today we'll really go into different types of polyester, but not really paper. But those are best. And with paper, it kind of allows, the air to just circulate. So what, if you've ever searched or bought archival grade materials before, you have come across Mylar sleeves. So Mylar are kind of like the premier kind of polyester that you keep photographs, or like this is a print document. And so they're typically L sleeves, which means that two sides are enclosed and the two other are open. And if you Google this, people get really into it with records and comic books and baseball cards, like what's the top, material, because plastics get very complicated. So everyone just goes to Mylar. They can kind of accumulate an electrostatic charge. And then Mylar is actually just a trade name. There's a few other brands, but Mylar's will come up if you start looking for these materials, and they're the polyester materials to save. Other than that, we have polyethylene, and it's a Mylar alternative. It's less durable, it's less transparent and less rigid than polyester, but it's cheaper and it's good for storing large amounts of paper. So in the photograph I have to the right, you can still see the image, but it's like you're kind of looking at it, it's a little bit cloudy, but you can still see the image for access. And it's a lot better if you're trying to store like 100 or 200 or several hundred photographs. It's a lot more cost effective. So that's kind of an overview on how to store photo prints. If you're storing negatives, you can store them in plastic sheets, kind of like this one. So plastics are very complicated. So you want to go to an archival supply store. And again, like Rena said last month, archival grade is not really a standard term. We want to go to the archival supply store to make sure we're getting actual archival grade materials. A lot of times I've seen them stored in what we call glassine sleeves. And a glassine sleeve, a really good example of that is when you buy stamps from the post office and they put it in a little envelope. That's a glassine sleeve. It's a little bit waxy, and those aren't good in humidity. So those can melt a little bit and damage the negatives, but if they're in that, they should be okay unless, you've got them in an environment that isn't very stable. Okay, so we're going to go over how to store a couple of different types of photographs that aren't just straight prints or negatives. So for daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, and tintypes, these are all, like you see on the right, they all kind of have a metal image to them. And most of these types were used between the 1830s and the 1860s. And tintypes were used as late as the 1930s, though. And this is where the photograph is developed directly onto the support material with no separate negative. It's kind of that's the photograph that we're looking at. That's the final product. And also you'll see these, especially daguerreotypes, under glass in kind of a case. You don't want to remove it from the case. You can really damage the photograph unless you have a conservator do it. But the way you want to store these is wrap them in acid-free buffered tissue and then put them in a box. And so at the right, we've got one, and I believe that was mounted onto a wood block. Somebody told me that was for printing. I don't know if that's true, but once it's wrapped in the tissue, then we put it in a box with others. And then another type that especially you'll see if you're in historical societies are these glass plate negatives. You really want to handle those with gloves, because whether or not you're going to deposit oils onto it, you can easily scratch them. You want to put them in 4 flap enclosures, like what's on the table there, where it kind of Velcros back together. You can see a little one on the far left. So they get placed in that, and then you store them vertically in a box on the long side. So the longest side is holding the weight of that, because those guys are kind of heavy, especially if you've got several, and they have special boxes for that to hold them upright. Okay, and so now we're going to talk about scrapbooks. For scrapbooks, if you have an heirloom family scrapbook, like the one we're looking at here, that's tied together with string and probably came from Browning photographs, do not attempt to fix it. You want to store it flat in a box. And then if you do want to scan the items, you want to use a standing book scanner or camera. You don't want to open it and put it on a flatbed scanner. That can really hurt the spine, hurt the materials. And what I've seen with these is sometimes they're albumen prints, which are kind of shiny on top, and they don't turn out well. So on the left-hand side is a photograph of the whole page. If I were to put it or try and straighten, do you see how the photo of the grotto, the edge is kind of turned up? I tried to straighten a couple of those and they were very brittle and they will break off because they've probably been bent like that for 70 years. This particular scrapbook dated back to 1912. And the best way to photograph it was just with I did it with, if you have a DSLR, that's great, but I did it with my phone. And then if you see on the bottom left-hand photograph that's enlarged, you see how on the bottom left it's a little bit shiny. So with your phone, you can kind of get a good angle where it's not shiny and then crop it. Whereas if you have a flatbed and you have the light going across, it's just, you're gonna get a lot of shine, I guess. Okay, and so if you're dead set on using a photo album, so let's say for your new photographs, and it's like, how do I store my new photographs? I would make a copy of the photograph, like one to pick, like one to save. Never put the original in a photo album. But if you wanted to use a photo album, you want to use photo corners, and this would also be for mounting photographs anywhere. And they're down there on the bottom left. So no glue touches the photographs. And it's almost like it's pinned to the page, but without any puncture of the photograph. And so there's no adhesive in contact with the photograph. So if you really want to use a photo album, this is the way to do it. Okay, so I went very quickly, but that's a really brief overview of how to save your different types of photos. This is like, again, just kind of trying to choose what fits best for your collection. Again, polyester is the top pick. Second is that polyethylene, which is an affordable second. And the thing with the polyester and the polyethylene, you can put the photos in back to back, so you can do 2 per sheet. And then we didn't discuss paper today because, as you see in the photograph, I can't see what photo's in there. So if I ever wanted to display it or use it, I have to open all of those. I mean, obviously you can write on the outside in pencil what it is, but I just like the clear ones better because it decreases handling. And the thing with paper and photographs, it doesn't seal the document, and it actually is better for humidity levels because it allows the air to circulate. But just for handling reasons, I prefer the polyethylene or the polyester. Okay, so our next webinar is in November, and we're going to cover book preservation. So how to, how to store your family Bible or any other family heirlooms that have been passed down from generation to generation. And Rena will be back, and Rena Shergan will teach us a little bit more about how to handle and preserve our family books. And that is November 16th, next month at 5 p.m. And the registration process is the same. It's our website /webinars to register. So backlog-archivist.com/webinars. All right. Does anybody have any questions? I know this was a very brief overview, but just trying to give you things that can be used. So if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself or to type it in the chat.
Steve Schoenbeck here.
Hi.
At the Webster Historical Society, one of the things we do have are an occasional tintype, but quite a number of glass plates. One of the glass plates that I came across stored rather improperly was cracked. I mean, is there anything you can do with that?
So a glass plate is a negative, so I don't know that you'd want to repair it, but the way I would store it is unless it's like shattered, I would put the two pieces in one of those 4 flaps that were shown and then place those in a box laying down.
Okay, okay, I think that would be it. It's like a little wedge cracked off, and I'm not even sure if it would be a part of the picture or not, but yes, thanks for the suggestion.
Yeah, and I know that's not a fix, and that you'd really have to go to a conservator for. But since you've kind of got the whole image there, those 4 flaps will keep any big pieces that have broken off all together. Usually there's like a little piece of Velcro that keeps it all together, so it shouldn't shake away to the bottom of the box.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. I'll wait another minute for questions. But along with the glass slides, something that I've seen a lot of are the lantern slides that I showed one of, and those were made for teaching usually. And so those are usually had been handled a lot in their lives and always were missing a corner or two. And since they're missing a corner, they're sharp and they're harder to handle. So that's when I always wanted thicker cotton gloves to pull them out of the little box, because those usually came with their own carrying case. And I've been told that that you can still make prints from the glass plate negatives, that sometimes that's things that photography students like to kind of play around with. Now that's not like for archival grade materials. So if lantern slides are loose in a box, the best way to store them is to store them the way we did the glass plate negatives, where you're putting them each in like a 4 flap and it Velcros together. And then like the one I showed was a very large, like 8x10. They have smaller ones, especially I want to say like lantern slides are like 3x4 maybe. Gaylord has a lot of like sizes, excuse me, for the different ones. So this is just about preservation, about how to handle things. We might cover how to digitize later this spring, and file types and storage media, that's a different beast. So this is just about physical photographs. Because especially with early digital photography, almost all of the cameras had their own file type, and that gets really tricky really fast. So to recommend a scanner, I have an Epson V600 and an Epson V800, and the V600 is $300 and I can scan prints and negatives. The V800 is about $1,200, and that's really great when you're digitizing a lot of Kodachrome slides. And that can, because the V800 can scan up to 2400 DPI. So when you're taking something this small and you want to make it really big, you really need it to be that detailed. But for everything else, including just normal negatives, the V600, which is about $300 on Amazon, is a good place to start. So I think this spring we'll do some more on how to digitize, but for right now, that's a service that we offer. But that gets really tricky. And a lot of that is capturing the right metadata at the time of the scan. So you're not, forgetting or losing anything that's written on the back of a photograph. But I think that's all the questions. I know this was brief, but I really just wanted to make sure that you could, all photographs can be preserved, especially like I showed you that envelope at the beginning. The better the environment, the better off the photograph is. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Have a good evening.